Thank you, Sally, and thank you for playing that beautiful song. I often like to listen to songs that speak to my grief. My son passed away 4 years ago from depression. I don't like to use the S word, so I say he died from depression, which he did. He was 19 years old and he fought a long and hard battle and succumbed to his illness after suffering for a little over 5 years. He never complained and he suffered in silence. And he told me that he did not want to die. He is my hero, and he might have been yours too if you had ever met him. I say I have two lives, one before his passing and the other after his passing. My life before was filled with much happiness and joy being his mother and that of his two older sisters, with the usual ups and downs life has to offer. And most notably was filled with a pretty strong faith. And then my life after he passed away was filled with a lot of sadness, suffocating grief, and next to nothing faith. A good friend of mine asked me what it felt like to lose a child, and I said that it felt like someone had ripped my arm off. That's the best way I could describe it. I wasn't whole anymore, and the pain was searing, and I physically felt that a piece of me was missing. I was convinced I was suffering from broken heart syndrome. I went to the cardiologist and he assured me that what I was experiencing was normal after the death of a child. Growing up, I can remember my mother always saying that all you need is faith the size of a mustard seed. Forever the optimist she was. I can always remember her always calling the Carmelite nuns at Port Tobacco, wherever Port Tobacco was, whenever she needed extra prayers for special intentions. I guess raising four daughters caused a lot of worry for her. I'm not sure why. It was recently that I actually just looked up the Carmelite nuns to see who exactly had been praying for us for so many years. And Port Tobacco, I learned, is a city in Southern Maryland, which isn't too far from me. So naturally, when my son developed depression at around 13, I did what any faith-filled person would do. I started praying more. I prayed more novenas. I went to adoration more. Oops, sorry. And I prayed for him for hours. I put his name in every church petition book that I could find. I took him to healing masses. I had a priest who people believed had healed their child offered to pray over my child, which of course I jumped at. As my son continued to worsen, despite all the best treatments money could buy, I ramped up the prayers because what else was there? I needed some divine intervention. And my mother's words rang in my ears. All you need is faith the size of a mustard seed. And I believed that. After all, it had gotten me this far in life. And although deep in my heart, I knew my son would most likely never be healed on earth, I always had that kernel of hope. So the night I got that dreaded and awful knock on my door, I found myself praying that it was actually Nicolas knocking on my front door. You see, I had just dropped him off at college, about to begin his sophomore year, about 2 days prior. I was trying to get in touch with him, but he wasn't answering. My daughter told me that I should get over to campus to check on him. I was trying to remain calm, and I didn't want to jump to any conclusions as I'd been in this situation before, but he always ended up answering. But this time seemed different, though I held on to faith the size of a mustard seed. I started texting his roommates, asking if they had seen him. And when even they didn't reply, I thought, well, maybe he's with them having a good time. Although in all likelihood, I knew that that most likely was not the case. But I held on to faith the size of a mustard seed. As the door knocker was knocking that night, I began praying beyond hope that it was him and his friends coming over to say hello, although all the while knowing that most likely was not the case. But I held on to faith the size of a mustard seed. I don't think I even let the officers come into my house because I knew what they were going to say. I ran out of the house down the street to get my mother, who lives a few houses down from me. I do remember that I called Father Dan, a good priest friend of ours, who thankfully answered his phone and came right over and stayed with me and my family well into the early morning hours. The rest is just a blur to me that I honestly don't want to remember. But what I do remember is Father Dan sitting in my living room saying, I can promise you some great grace will come from this. And in my oblivion and fog, I can remember thinking very clearly, what in the world is he saying? How can anything good possibly come out of the death of my child? I didn't sign on to have my son sacrificed for some common good. And that's the way I understood his words. That's the way I processed it. So I stopped praying. I was just thinking, like, why would I pray anymore? It just all became a big joke to me. And I felt like I was the butt of the joke because after all, I had believed if you prayed, your prayers would be answered. I'd lived a good life. I did what I was supposed to do. Well, mostly. But this is not what was supposed to happen. After all, I had faith the size of a mustard seed, and having that faith was supposed to be rewarded. At least in my mind, it was supposed to be. I normally would look forward to going to Sunday Mass. I had even become a few times a week daily Mass goer. It all seemed like the winning formula until it wasn't. And for the first time in my life, I had to force myself to go to Sunday Mass. Forget about all the daily masses that I had been going to. I mean, in our family, Sunday Mass was just the center of our universe. Everything we did revolved around Sunday Mass. But for me, all things religious just stopped. There was a real struggle between good and evil, which played over and over again in my head every Sunday. I sat in the church, stone-faced, willing myself to stay until the end. But then I had faith the size of a mustard seed. As I was continuing to spiral downhill, grasping at straws to try to assuage the unbearable pain, I joined an online non-denominational support group, which really turned into an anti-religious support group where talk of any faith and religion were literally hated upon. The group eventually ended up splintering off and a faith-based group was started. But before this occurred, I had pored over people's comments looking for any words of wisdom and comfort. I just wanted the pain to stop. And after reading accounts of people who had no faith, say that people of faith seemed to live in hope and fare better in their lives and were better able to deal with their grief after the death of their child, it dawned on me, hey, that's me, or hey, that used to be me. I am or was that faith-filled person. And despite my best efforts to turn away from God, God was still after me and sent me messages from the non-believers. I guess he really had to hit me over the head. And what I found completely fascinating was that these agnostics were saying the reason the believers fared better was because they believed that they would see their child again in the next life. And all of this was before I even had heard about the Emmaus ministry. And I have to be honest, at first, I really didn't find too much comfort in this because I wanted to be with my son now. But I thought, well, you know what? My lack of faith sure isn't getting me anywhere, but sinking me into a deep, dark abyss. So maybe I'd better try this faith thing again. And then I remembered all it takes is faith the size of a mustard seed. At first, I'd ask people to pray for me because I was still unable to do so for myself. I literally would put it on blast on Facebook, please pray for me. And people would private message me and say they had been, always will be, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, whenever I have casual conversations with friends and acquaintances, I'd always end with, please pray for me. I really need your prayers. And I actually still do this. I am forever grateful for these people, some total strangers who prayed for me, because I have no doubt without their prayers, I would not be here today. One day, a school mom who had a child in the same class as Nicolas came up to me and said that she was praying to Nicolas. I was I was stunned, first of all, that someone thought that much of my son to actually be using him as an intercessory. And second, that she was actually praying to him. My son, just your average boy. And then I got to thinking, well, gosh, like, why aren't I praying to him? He's my son after all. And it was then that I started praying to my son, asking him in my words to get all of his, friends, meaning all of the angels and saints in heaven together to help me and his family. I specifically prayed to him that I would not be sad anymore. I mean, I know I always will be sad. I just wanted to be able to learn to walk alongside of my grief instead of being grief stricken 24/7. And as I started to ask for his help in prayer, it was then that I began to see Father Dan's words coming to fulfillment. Many graces will come from this, because as later I learned, faith is your positive response to God's grace, by grace through faith. And it's when I remembered I had faith the size of a mustard seed, I began to see the many graces God had given me and continues to give me and my family. Things that were insurmountable before literally are at our fingertips. And we just all kind of look at each other, and then, collectively we say, Nico, that's what we called him. Other people would think we're crazy, but we know full well that it is God's grace, or what I was taught about grace, gifts from God. The grace we have been given helps me survive each and every day. And it's almost as if I feel I am being carried now. My son carried his cross with the utmost of grace, and I can only hope to carry mine now with the many graces that have been bestowed upon us. And on my most awful of days, and there are still many, I literally find myself crying out to God and Mary to please comfort me, because at the end of the day, all any of us have to fall back on is our faith. And all we need is faith the size of a mustard seed to see us through. It is what has gotten me through all of the horrendous ups and downs of life. And I have faith that it will get you through too, until we are joyfully reunited with our precious children, which I do find comfort in knowing now. I know my son is happy and he's enjoying his eternity. And that's what I've always prayed and wanted for him. Even before he was born, I would always pray that he would be happy. I do find some comfort in knowing that. And I oftentimes will think and reflect on how he suffered so on this earth, and he no longer is suffering, as he is now in heaven, safe and in God's loving embrace. I do know he's in heaven because I asked him to send me a sign. It just made me sadder when I felt he was still struggling in purgatory. And this is a bit of a backstory, but when he was about 7 years old, I had been praying the novena to Saint Therese of Lisieux, also known as the Little Flower. I don't even remember what I was praying about at the time, but he had gone to Home Depot with his dad to get something, and he came back with a rose for me. I was truly shocked. I mean, it was so random. I don't know of too many people that have ever gone to Home Depot and come back with a rose. But I said to Nicolas, I said, where did you get this? Why did you bring this to me? And just 100 other questions. And once I got that rose, I knew my prayers would be answered. And it was recently when the novena came around again. And yes, I'm back to praying my novenas. Midway through, I remembered this story. And I said, Nicolas, if you are in heaven, send me a sign. The very next day, I was walking to my car on 17th Street in DC, along with all the other DC commuters. And this young girl, who was accompanied by a guy, was carrying this most beautiful bouquet of roses that I had ever seen, with the most vibrant colors. I remember specifically there was a beautiful blue rose and a beautiful orange rose that stood out to me. And I feel like blue was for the Blessed Mother, and orange was his favorite colors. He sends me the most perfect signs. The young lady who was carrying the roses literally knocked into me. I then knew that yes, he was in heaven, and it brought me much peace. I think what I've learned is that prayer might not always be answered as I like because it's God's will and not mine, but that prayer will get you through the awful times. A priest said to me that my prayers for Nicolas might have led him to being on this earth longer than if I had never prayed for him. And I guess one day I will find that out. I don't sit in church stone-faced anymore. I join in some prayers, and if the Spirit moves me, I'll sing a few songs. I don't contemplate not going anymore, but I still don't go to daily mass, but I do think about going again. A friend of mine told me about the devotion of the 7 Sorrows of Mary, and I find myself praying that daily, and I do find it to be a comfort. I was recently reading this prayer, and this line from the prayer caught my attention. A life of holiness like that of a saint is more important than a life free of suffering. It really made me think and take pause. I mean, who wants to suffer? And I guess that's why I am nowhere near being a saint. But I can keep my eye on the prize, which is our Father in heaven. And I hope to be with my son in eternity one day. Life on earth is but a blip, but eternity, well, that is forever. And all I need to remember is that all it takes is faith, faith the size of a mustard seed.